Hi everyone, Stepan here. In this video I'm going to show you 5 Caro-Kann games by probably the best Caro-Kann player in the world currently, Alireza Firouzja, also probably one of the best players in the world. He's currently number 2, over 2800. So whenever you study an opening and you want to play it seriously in tournament games, I think the best way to learn it is to look at games by players who actually play the opening, and you learn from their ideas, their opening novelties, their opening preparation. For the Caro-Kann, Alireza Firouzja is currently by far the best resource, and I've been looking at his games for a long time. He's the only player at the top level who plays the Caro-Kann regularly, which makes me very happy. I mean, it's my favorite opening, and if the world number 2 plays it regularly, then that justifies my choice. He is the best Caro-Kann player now. If you wanted to study the Caro-Kann 20 or 30 years ago, you would look at Anatoly Karpov, for example. There are other players, but what I'm trying to say is you should always model your play in a certain opening according to the best player. Today I'm going to show you 5 games. All of them were very interesting, extremely instructive, and I chose them not because of tactical motifs or beautiful finishes, even though one of his most famous games is among the 5 I chose, but because they were interesting for the Caro-Kann player. So if you play the Caro-Kann, or if you play e4 and face the Caro-Kann, this should be useful. If you don't play either of those, then, well, the games are instructive either way. So let's start. The first game, he faced Sergey Karjakin in the FIDE Online Nations Cup. E4, of course, and we have the Caro-Kann. And in this position, Karjakin chose the advance variation. Now, Alireza does a few things against the advance, and this is probably the variation I've been looking at most in his games, because this is the variation I'm struggling with most myself. Okay, he plays bishop f5 almost always, or always. Okay, knight f3, e6, all very normal. Bishop e2, Karjakin is playing the short. And in this position, knight d7 is the most popular move. Most people play knight d7. Alireza chose knight e7, and you're going to see this in one more game. And this is actually a very interesting choice. It's not clear why knight e7 is played until you see it. And if you don't know this pattern, if you don't know the idea, then you're not going to understand the move. In this position, you can castle, which is the main move, which Karjakin did not do. In one other game, I'm going to show you what Firouzja does against castling. Karjakin played knight bd2, and now the immediate c5. And the idea is you want your e knight on c6. It is possible to break the position open with c4 here, but it wouldn't be as good because the knight still defends d5. So dc is the most popular move, and Karjakin chose that. Knight e6, and the idea is, of course, this knight came to c6. The other knight is going to come to d7, and then there's going to be double pressure on the e5 pawn, which has to be defended. And also pressure on c5, which did not have to be captured immediately. This is just a better choice because b4 isn't possible, knight b4. Okay, Karjakin played knight b3, preventing bishop c5. And here is the other interesting point, which I cannot highlight enough. This can be seen in some variations, in some lines of the advance variation. And it's almost always a good idea. And the idea is to exchange your bishop on f5. If you know the advanced variation at all, then you know that the immediate bishop d3 isn't good, because black just exchanges and plays e6. Why is that? Well, in this pawn structure, because there's a pawn on e5, black has a hard time defending h7. Conversely, his king side is almost always weak. It's never weak if the light square bishops are traded off. So what Firouzja is trying to do here is trade off white's main attacker. This is obviously black's good bishop, this is his bad bishop. So trading these two off is a good idea because there is no problem on h7. Whenever there's a pawn on e5, h7 is hard to defend. Obviously getting the knight to f8 would be too time consuming. Okay, now in this position, knight fd4 has been played once, and then bishop e2, queen e2, knight d4, bishop c5, knight b3, simply castles, knight c5 runs into queen a5, and this is a very safe position for black, because there's no attack. It's very hard to attack with the dark squared bishop, but more importantly, black has this very nice pawn structure with the weaknesses to target c3 of course, c2 of course, and also e5. In this game, Karjakin simply castled. Okay, now you don't want to take the knight on f3, even though if it's forced, you would rather do that than go back. I think you want to trade off the bishop. Okay, knight d7, continuing with the plan. And you can see the harmony in Firouzja's position. Everything is just working together perfectly. Okay, knight e1 played. Instead of knight d4, bishop takes, queen takes. And now simply knight takes c5. e5 is of course still a weakness. And any f4 would mean that queen b6 and bishop c5 ideas become way more dangerous. So f4 really isn't advisable. Also, while there's still a pawn on e5, white's c1 bishop doesn't have as much scope. In this position, it can go to e3 or to d2. None of these are really good squares. For the moment, the queen defends g5, and the bishop on f4 wouldn't be doing much. Knight c5, bishop c5, knight d3 attacks the bishop simply drops back. Queen to g4. Okay, now comes the third interesting point in the game. And this is something you can see in Firouzja's games all the time, which weaker players are afraid of and which doesn't come without a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience, I think. And that's not being afraid of threats which aren't really that dangerous. So queen g4 seems nice, attacks g7. Firouzja simply plays king f8, and this is extraordinary. And you may think, okay, white is going to be attacking black for the rest of the game. Well, that's not true. Queen h5, king g8. Fine, making the king a bit better and giving him possibilities like g6 and other stuff. Bishop e3. Rook c8, simply developing. Rook a1, queen a5. Is this a queenside counterattack? a3, queen a4. The queen is now controlling the king side and the queen side. c3, a5. a5 may not be the most precise move, but it actually puts the brakes on white's queenside expansion. And if the queen moves and black gets to play a4, then this means that these two pawns will basically be locking down the 3 pawns white has on the queen side, which is of course positionally very beneficial for black. Okay, bishop g5. h6 doesn't mind the trade because the knight is coming to f5. Knight e7, bishop e7, knight e7, h3, knight f5. Okay, rook fe1. And even though he moved his king away, didn't castle, his king is actually very safe. His knight on f5 is very good. I wouldn't say it's better than the knight on d3 because the knight on d3 is good, has the f4 square. But most importantly, he has a better pawn structure. He has weaknesses to target. Karjakin really does not. Okay, rook c4 played. Rook is coming into play. g3. Queen c6. Maybe preparing a4. Maybe preparing b5. A simple minority attack. Queen f3. h5. Gaining space on both sides of the board. Knight f4. Fine. g6, defending the h5 pawn, giving his king the g7 square. If need be, he doesn't have to do it. Rook d2, b5, very simple. And you can see that he just keeps gaining space, keeps gaining small advantages. But all of these decisions that led to the small advantages took a lot of courage and had to be calculated. Because b5 and his next move, g5, they're both very weakening moves, and they're both very risky moves. If there's a punish at white's disposal, then black could be in trouble after a move like g5, but there isn't. Okay, queen g2, king f8. Okay, getting away from the g file. King h2, king e7. And this is incredible. Now, Do you remember when Karjakin played queen g4? It seemed like white is going to be the one attacking. Well, things have changed. Look at the rook. Look at the queen. Look at the knight. These two pawns are very menacing. What are white's rooks doing? Alireza has managed to completely outplay Karjakin on all three sides of the board by making constant small threats. Firstly, positional threats on the queen side. Now a king side attack. Okay, queen h1 played. It's very hard to suggest moves for white. Rook d8 now switches once again. Rook d1, rook e4. And the pieces are just creeping closer together. Of course, now if the knight moves, you can take on e5. Queen to g2, queen c4. King g1, rook g8. The rook just came back. And the position is about to open up. Queen h1, Karjakin is just waiting. And now rook g6. Okay. Queen g2, knight h4. The point of rook g6 was to simply defend the rook, making knight h4 a move, because now if that's taken, the queen is lost. While the rook was on g8, knight h4 wouldn't work because it takes, and then queen takes rook. Queen h1 played, g4 played. You cannot take the knight because I just win with a couple of discovered checks. Instead, yeah, actually he did take the knight. You should probably take the pawn. I don't know. Gh4 was played, gh3 check, king f1, and simply h2. This happened in 5 moves. He just won the game. And what can you do here? Here Karjakin resigned. If you take the pawn, then rook h4, and you lose the queen. So this position, everything is already very dominant for black. Rook g8 just goes back, and then rook g6, preparing knight h4. King f1 pins the knight, so you can take on e5. It's very hard to suggest moves. This was just a crushing victory. Firstly, very interesting ideas in the opening, and then very bold play, not fearing the consequences, possible consequences of his advances. Just, I thought this was a very instructive game. I hope you didn't see it before. Okay, the next one is probably one of his most famous games. If not his most famous game, I don't know. I think it's definitely his most famous Caro-Kann game. This was played in the Norway Chess against Aryan Tari. We have the exchange variation, bishop d3, and he plays knight f6. Knight c6 is the most common move, and then knight c6, bishop f4, and so on. c3, bishop g4. Okay, this is sort of normal. Queen b3, queen c7. Doesn't want to run into knight e5 eventually after knight d2, knight f3. h3 chasing the bishop away, and it is possible to play bishop h5, but he simply plays bishop to d7. And this idea is well known, blocking in your bishop with e6 instead of leaving it outside of the pawn chain, but it gives you a lot of security. And after knight f3, knight c6, castles e6, the bishop may seem bad, but he has other plans. Okay, so this is a slightly strange exchange, Caro-Kann. But what he did from here is extraordinary. I would say it's an absolute novelty. Okay, rook e1, bishop d6, bishop g5, and now simply castles. Bishop takes knight is not good. If bishop takes knight, then pawn takes. Any queen c2, you just have king h8, and then look at the bishops, look at rook g8, and maybe even knight d4 ideas. So after castles, knight bd2 played, and now knight h5. Not only to prevent the doubling of the pawns, but this knight is coming to f4. And in conjunction with black's pawns, this is going to be a deadly attack, which may seem absurd for the moment. And usually you would like to play a6, b5, and rook b8, and maybe prepare e5. But here he found a new idea. I never saw this before I saw this game. Okay, queen d1, indirectly attacking the knight. f6 chases the bishop away. Bishop e3, and knight f4. If you want to give up your dark squared bishop, that's fine. You don't want to give up your light squared bishop. Definitely not. Okay, so bishop f1. And now how do you continue the attack? Well, g5. And white has to start looking for counterplay. I mean, if you don't do anything, I'm just going to improve my pieces. I could even play h4 and h5 and then g4. I could play king h8 and rook g8 and rook f8. I could play rook f7, rook f8. I could break with e5. There are a ton of ideas. This game ended in about 10 moves. Okay, c4 makes sense. You want to start getting counterplay. King h8, calm. Rook c1, rook g8, very normal. Bishop f4. Okay, so Tari exchanges. Bishop takes f4. b4 continues queenside play. Queen d6. b5, fine. Knight e7. He doesn't want to give up a knight. c5 chases the queen to c7. Doesn't really change anything. The queen is still on a great diagonal. And now g3. So Tari thought he was winning a piece. But okay, I don't know what to say about this. This may be the most beautiful sequence in the Caro-Kann I've seen in a while. He plays g4. So if you take the bishop, then queen takes, and I'm threatening to take the knight, I'm threatening to take here with check, so let's say king to h1, and then just gf3. And other pieces are coming into play as well. This is dead lost. So after g4, Tari took on g4. Okay, rook takes g4, now the bishop cannot be taken. He played bishop h3, rook g7, doesn't want to give up a rook, king h1, now threatening to take the bishop, now e5. Attacks the bishop on h3, so if you take on f4, I take on h3, so Tari took on d7, queen takes d7. Now if you take the bishop in this position, then it's just checkmate, because the queen transferred to the light square diagonal, so takes and here. And after king g1, queen g2. So Tari played knight h2, queen h3 anyway. Now if you take the bishop, queen g2 is mate, so rook g1. Rook a to g8, another rook comes into play. Now if you take the bishop, you lose the queen. Queen e2, so now he is not losing the queen. e4. This is just beautiful. So okay, take the bishop. Let's see what happens. Rook g2. And how do you defend mate? If you take the rook, then I just play rook takes g2, or then I just play queen takes g2 and checkmate. If you don't do anything, I take on h2 with mate. So after e4, completely ignoring this bishop for 6 moves, rook c3 played. Knight f5, another piece is coming into play. In this position, if you take the bishop, then rook takes g1 is mate. So now that the rook has moved to c3, you are not defending the g1 rook anymore. So after knight f5, knight e4 played, d4, queen e4, and now the final blow, bishop takes g3. If fg3, then rook g3, and if rook g3, then knight g3 check, and you have to take. And now this is going to be mate. You have no way of defending both squares. There's just no way. So bishop takes g3, rook g2 played, rook e7 played, attacking the queen, threatening a mate on e1. Because if, for example, queen d5, rook e1, rook g1, queen h2. Okay, queen b1 played, and now rook g2 e8 was the final move of the game. Again, the same threat. You cannot move the rook on g2. You cannot take the bishop because I win your queen. You cannot do anything. But this wasn't the instructive part. The tactical sequence in the end was great, but how he came to that is just extraordinary. So this position is a relatively normal exchange Caro-Kann, and f6, knight f4, and then g5. This is an amazing idea. This, if you play the Caro-Kann, you have to know this. If you play the exchange against the Caro-Kann, you have to know this as well. Okay, next game is MVL versus Firouzja in the Tata Steel this year. again, we have the advanced variation, and I chose this game, even though Alireza didn't win it, it was still extremely interesting. So we have the same variation, bishop e2 and knight e7. And as you saw in the first game against Karjakin, Karjakin played knight bd2 here. MVL castled, and now c5. And this is a relatively forced sequence. White sort of has to play c4. If he doesn't play c4, then the knight is coming to c6 and everything is great. So c4. Okay, knight bc6 and d takes c5. And in this position, you can play d4. d4 is the main move. Leads to a lot of complications. The second most popular, which has been played about 40 times, it's a relatively new idea, is dc4, and he chose that. Now, a queen trade would favor black, because c5 is about to fall. I have the d5 for my knight. e5 is a permanent weakness. You cannot play b4. Bishop b5 after you take doesn't do much. So no queen trade. Instead, bishop takes c4. And now knight g6. This was for me a new idea. You are leaving control of the d5 square, simply putting double pressure on e5, preventing knight h4, so you don't lose your bishop. Bishop e3, defending c5, simply bishop to e7. It doesn't matter, you can win your pawn later. Bishop b5 castles, okay, bishop c6, no pressure on e5 anymore, bc6, and I thought, well, what's the point? You're a pawn down, your bishop on f5 is sort of awkward, could c6 be weak after something like queen a4, what if white trades queens now? Well, actually, it's not easy for white to keep the pawn. One of these pawns is going to fall, and black is at least equal. Knight a3, queen b8, putting pressure on b2, declining the queen trade, preparing rook d8. Knight c4, looking at the d6 square. This started to seem very dangerous in my eyes, strategically. If the knight is going to be sitting on d6, how can black be equal? Well, bishop e4, knight e6, bishop d5. Who is better here and why? What's the knight doing on d6? The bishop has a very clear purpose. I don't want to give it up on f3 to take on e5, but if I can win another pawn, then maybe I'm going to do it. So after something like b3, although I don't think this is a good idea, because for the moment you don't lose the c6 pawn, but it can, d6 can be defended, it's still something to bear in mind. Maybe knight d7, knight f6, knight d5, and again, who is better and why. But after b3, again, a surprising move, which again makes a ton of sense. f6, undermining the structure, weakening e6, and getting rid of white's biggest weakness seemed very counterintuitive to me. But actually, after ef6, bishop f6, you firstly gain a tempo on the rook, and now you get to play queen b4. And again, if you saw the first game against Karjakin, then this is starting to look very similar. The queen is on the queen side, looking at the king side. The bishops are dangerous, the rooks are coming into play, and again, this knight, even though it may seem aesthetically pleasing, what's it doing? I mean, what's the concrete purpose of the knight on d6? So Karjakin, MVL agrees, plays knight c4, blocking in the queen. You don't want to give up your great bishop, of course. Bishop to e7, putting pressure on c5, maybe threatening bishop to f3. Bishop takes f3. Knight e1, stopping bishop f3. Rook a d8, threatening bishop g2, or bishop takes c4, even worse. No, actually bishop c4, rook c4. No, bishop c4, rook c4, rook d1. Yeah, the queen is not protected because of knight e1. So queen e2, defending against that. Queen b8. And again, the bishops look great. He wasn't interested in winning a pawn. He could have won the pawn. Knight d3. MVL's pieces do look nice, but... Okay, rook f5. f3, defending. Knight h4. And again, the same pattern. He isn't afraid to start attacks which mean that he weakens his position. In this case, moving the knight isn't an irreparable weakness because it can go back. It's not moving a pawn, but it still seems like a very double-edged move. Okay, rook f2 defends g2 preemptively. King h8. We know what's coming. Maybe. f4, knight g6. I don't think rook g8 was sound in this position. I think you have to, well, start bringing your pieces back. The knight has sort of served its purpose. Knight c5, knight e5, knight e5, queen b4. And this game Alireza didn't win, as I said. It ended in a draw. But the way he fought and the way he just played the pawn down throughout the game, declined to take it back, and he was the one attacking despite white's beautiful knight on d6 was very instructive for me. Okay, queen c2 played, king g8, in some cases preventing knight f7, rook d1, bishop f6, knight c4, and now a almost forced sequence, bishop c4, bc4, rook d1, queen d1, bishop e7, threatening to take on c5, and queen b3, queen e1 check, rook f1, takes, takes, takes. And here they agreed to a draw. This is obviously an equal rook endgame on their level. But again, the opening ideas were, for me, very instructive, eye-opening. Plays dc4 and then plays knight g6. And then just bishop e7. He's not afraid to be some material down temporarily. It doesn't matter. He knows where his pieces should go, and he is able to compensate for the material loss with activity. Okay, let's get on to the next game. This game was played in the European Team Championship just a few days ago. His opponent was Markus Rager. I believe he's German, although I could be wrong. So don't take my word for it. So this is going to sound weird, but Markus Rager is, compared to Firouzja, a weak player. He's 2668 at the time of the game. Firouzja was close to 2800. And the 100-point difference at their level is just huge. And the way he dealt with a player rated close to 2700 is frightening. Okay, we have the two knights in this one and bishop g4, which I've studied every single one of Firouzja's bishop g4 games because that's my main repertoire against the two knights. h3 we have the main line, bishop takes, queen takes, e6, and bishop to e2. Now in this position, several moves are considered optimal. Knight f6, knight d7, g6, even bishop c5. What Firouzja did is very, very rare and very, very risky, and that's d4. This obviously forces the knight back to b1, but it releases the central tension in a very unhealthy way. And the flexibility is gone in black's position. You're basically committing to playing e5 eventually, which means that both c3 and f4 are going to be way more consequential. Okay, the knight drops back to b1, and now simply knight e7. h4, h5 wants to prevent an expansion. d3, and again knight g6. Queen h3 was played, which prepares f4 in some positions, gets the queen away in any case, and also defends the h4 pawn for the moment. But Alireza just plays on the other side of the board now, just a5. f4 was played, and now e5. This, when I was looking at I was watching the game live, I just thought, okay, I would never play like this. What's the idea? And I had the board next to me, I was analyzing the positions. I just thought that this cannot be good. This has to be too risky. Okay, he's not playing me. He's not playing a FIDE master or a normal grandmaster or a very weak player like me. He's playing someone close to 2700. So of course, after e5, f5, knight e5, why just castles? Okay, so how are you going to play this position? The bishop is maybe coming to g5. h5 seems loose. What happens when the knight comes to f3? Are you going to defend your knight? What's going on? Knight bd7, knight d2, bishop d6, a4, preventing any further expansion, knight f6. Okay, he has the g4 square. f7 is sufficiently defended. Where is his king going to go? That was still unclear to me, but it seemed okay. Knight f3. The pawn is hanging on d4 for the moment, but that's solved with knight eg4. If you take on d4, then bishop h2 wins the knight. So bishop g5, queen d7, still the same threat, knight d4, bishop h2. Knight d2, maybe looking at the c4 square, trying to put pressure on the d6 bishop, maybe trying to reinforce something on f7 or on f6. Knight h7, declines the trade, and leaves the option for white to take on g4. And this surprised me a lot. I thought if you allow bishop g4 without the other knight being able to recapture, you don't really have anything. But watch what happened. Knight c4, knight takes g5. Okay, you can take on d6, but he took on g5. And now bishop h2 check. A tempo, getting the king to h1, and bishop c7. And in this position, Rager did take on g4. And I was really surprised, because you cannot take with the pawn, which you would like to do, because your rook is hanging. So you have to take with the queen. And it's clear that if queen takes queen, black should have a great attack. So for example, something like this. And rook h5 and castles queenside, rook h8, even taking on g5, maybe g3 to start things off. And if white plays g3, then rook h3. So that's clear. But after queen takes g4, white doesn't have to do that. And where is black's attack? White just played rook f3, which made a ton of sense. And now a move okay, it's a good move. It's sort of obvious in this position, but since you are biased by previous play and previous ideas, at least weaker players are, and since it's not easy to completely switch plans to something totally different, this came as a huge surprise to me. He castled. And I just thought, okay, you're not losing your pawn on g4 because queen takes, pawn takes, rook g3 is defended, but white can just play e5, and now you may just lose your pawn. Okay, rook a8, queen takes g4, h takes g4, rook g3, and now b5. Okay, the knight has to move, knight d2, rook e5, rook g4, and rook e2. And in this position I started, white played knight f3 and then c5 was played. And here I started thinking, okay, well, maybe this does make a lot of sense. Black seems to be just much better here. The material is equal. White shouldn't really take on b5 because rook c2. But the more I started looking for plans for white, I just couldn't find them, and it seems that black is winning here. Those were my thoughts at the time. And later, when I analyzed with the engine, yes, but black is just winning here, which seems incredible. I mean, he just castled, got, I'm sure he saw this beforehand, and just got a winning endgame. So switching plans is of course something that all strong players do, but looking at his games, especially in the Caro-Kann, the Caro-Kann is an opening which, I'm not going to say it's inflexible, but usually when you find the plan, you sort of stick with it. Because changing plans doesn't come easy. You have to change the pawn structure too much. And he does that in the Caro-Kann, which Karpov never did. If you look at Karpov's game in the Caro-Kann, he just did the thing he wanted to do. He either succeeded and won the game, or he didn't, and something else happened. Or he switched plans once he failed. Firouzja seems to be just switching plans. Whatever is best at the moment, he just does it. He's not afraid to change plans and to risk a lot, which... that's why he's one of the best. Okay, rook c1. ba4 takes the pawn, king g1, rook b8. And you can see that white's position is just falling apart. King f1, rook e6. I mean, this is how the game ended. It's just... nothing special happened. He just has much better pieces, some extra material, and his technique was, of course, perfect. There's basically nothing white can do. Just pushes on, makes all of his pieces better. This is how the game ended. I mean, it's 3 pawns up. Again, I wanted to show you the instructive part, which, I mean, his games are very instructive. Okay, the final game I want to show you is also from the European Team Championship, also played a few days ago. This is against Viktor Erdos, who is rated only 2600. Compared to Firouzja's rating, that's low. Again, we have the two knights, again bishop g4, and again we reach this position. Now here, Erdos played d4, which is one of the most common moves. And usually I take on e4, because if knight e4, then you could get away with queen d4. It's a very risky capture, but I usually win my games after queen d4. White gets a lot of development and a lot of tempi, but okay. Firouzja played knight f6. You're never afraid of e5 because you get a good French defense. So if e5, knight d7, you're gonna play c5, and you have a French, but your bishop has been traded off. And most importantly, your bishop has been traded off for the knight that either jumps into f4 from e2 or jumps into g5 from c3. So one of white's key attacking pieces in the French has been traded off, and this is just a nice French defense. So e5 is not a threat, and black has a threat of his own now. Now you want to take on e4, and in this case, white is forced to take with the knight, because the queen is hanging, and then queen takes d4. So e d5, c d5, bishop d3. Knight c6, putting pressure on d4, knight d2 defending, preparing c3. h6, preventing bishop g5, c3, bishop d6, all very normal. And again, we have this Carlsbad pawn structure, which we get in the exchange Caro-Kann, which we get in the Queen's Gambit declined. And black's plans involve pushing the queenside pawns. And in this game, he did exactly that. So if you showed this position to any decent player and asked him what's black supposed to do, anybody would say, okay, I want to play rook b8 and b5. Maybe queen c7, rook castles, rook fc8, and just push my pawns, weaken c3, play knight a5, knight c4, get a positional bind on the queen side. In the meantime, white is going to try to attack your king, and if he doesn't, then there are no other decent plans. White has to attack the king side. Okay, bishop c2, rook c8, g4, fine, that's very normal. He has to do that. King d7. King d7. Okay, you've played rook c8, so you're not castling queenside. Also, you want to push b5. If you castle kingside, then g5 is coming. So king d7. I mean, this is a very cold-blooded move, which may be objectively best, but I'm sure many people wouldn't play it. I'm sure you would rather try to find a waiting move instead of committing your king to d7. g5 anyway, hg5, bishop g5, king c7. He moved his rook, he cannot castle queenside, he's gonna get his king to b8 anyway. It's basically short castles on the queen side with rook on c8 and king on b8. Castles, king b8, rook dg1. And now you think, okay, so what's the plan? Maybe you want to put pressure on h3. How do you do that? Well, it's hard to play rook h5 because of bishop f6. You cannot play rook h7 because of bishop h7. I mean, what do? You cannot put pressure on h3. Maybe you would like to trade off the dark squared bishop, but the knight is on e2, so bishop f4 is really never happening. Maybe you would like to move your queen away to give your knight h5, but then you lose the pawn on f6. Maybe knight a5, knight c4. Maybe if the bishop moves some knight b4 ideas. Maybe just wait with king a8 because I don't know what to do. Well, What he did here is something I'm sure I wouldn't do in one of my games, and I've had positions like this quite often, and in the Caro-Kann it's very hard to come up with plans in some structures of the Caro-Kann. And this, in my opinion, is one of them. So what did he do here? He played b5. So just went for a minority attack with his king on b8, just completely ignoring everything else that's going on, because it's objectively the best plan. It does weaken a ton of squares. But what about queen d3, bishop d3? What about a4? What's going on? But it's just the best move. a3, a5, wants to play b4. Queen d3 attacking the b5 pawn, queen b6, no matter. f6 is not attacked anymore. But okay, f6 takes, rook g7, just defends, queen b7, defending b5 and f7, rook h to g1, b4. It doesn't matter. White cannot play rook g8. You don't want to take on h3, of course, because then rook g8 is possible. He just continues with the minority attack. When have you seen the minority attack with the king on b8 and the queen on b7? I never saw it. So again, I was looking at this game live, and I was taking notes. I mean, this is, for a Caro-Kann player, this has to be extremely instructive, unless you're as good as he is. Okay, a4 blocks the attack. Now you don't have knight a5, knight c4. Bishop f8 evicts the rook. Rook h7. Through in bishop h6 check. Fine. King d1. Of course, you don't want your king on b1 because of bc. King d1, and now f5. Undefending the rook, so Erdos is the one that has to trade. So rook takes, rook g3, defending h3. Rook c8, switching plans again. Nothing's going on the king side anymore. White is not breaking through. Knight f4 isn't even a possibility, so why not continue? King e1, white starts running away. It's funny that Alireza played king d7, king c7, king b8, and now Erdos is playing king b1, king c1, king d1, king u1. bc3 anyway, bc3, knight e7. The knight is coming into g6 maybe. Okay. King f1 keeps running away, king a7. This I failed to understand, but the point is that I think if the queen moves, then queen b5 is not check, and also if c4 comes, in some positions bishop e4 isn't check. So okay, those are my ideas, because obviously there's a downside as well. After c4, if white is able to play c4, then knight c3 and knight b5 comes with check. But okay, rook g1. I'm guessing he wanted to play king g2 and then connect his rook with the bishop on b1. Queen a6 offers a queen trade, and again, this is a transposition into an endgame in which white is just lost. I mean, maybe the engine evaluation isn't that harsh, but it's much easier for black to play. And look at these pawns. All of these are weak. White has 4 weaknesses, black has none, because the a5 pawn can be defended by the king. Okay, white took anyway. Takes, bishop d3 check, king a7, bishop b5, and now what happened was extremely instructive. Knight g8, knight f6, knight e4. Double attacking one weakness. Of course, c4 is prevented. Rook d1, knight c3 can be taken. Knight c3, rook c3. Of course, after knight c3 you don't have rook c1 because bishop c1. Rook c3, pawn up, thank you very much. 4 isolated pawns, and Alireza has 2 pawn islands. This is overwhelming. The fact that it's opposite color bishops doesn't mean anything. Even if you trade rooks, I think black could win. Bishop e8 attacks the pawn, rook c7 defends. And now what's important is that he keeps the defense of the h6 square so that white doesn't get to play h6. So after bishop b5 you cannot take on d4 just yet because h6 comes and then you lose. Or you draw. King f6 just preparing king g5 to take the pawn with the king. King d3 defends d4, king g5, rook a8. an exchange of pawns, and king g4. And from here on, it's just trivial. Again, white has too many weaknesses. Black has one pawn island now, and the a4 pawn is absolutely not a problem. Here's how the game ended. White tried, but it really wasn't possible. This is a nice trick. If you take the rook, I take your rook, and then it is a draw, but he can throw in rook a3 check, and white resigned here. Obviously, king moves, I take your rook for free. Again, an incredible game. There are more of his Caro-Kann games, and I've studied all of them. I think I've been through every single one of his Caro-Kann games. If you play the Caro-Kann, look at all of them. I chose 5 that I thought were really instructive, and I chose 5 of probably my favorite ones. Look at more of his games. If you don't play the Caro-Kann, maybe start playing it because of Firouzja. I hope you got something from the video. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.